Welcome to Whistle Where You Work. I'm Mark Cohen, Executive Director of the Government Accountability Project. In just a few minutes, we'll be talking with a man who successfully blew the whistle on a university for inflating its successes in retaining at-risk students. But first, the safety and security of our water supply. We need it to live, to bathe, to recreate, but it's in peril due to global warming, natural gas drilling, and other sources of contamination. With me to explore what can be done about it are Katherine Baer of the conservation organization American Rivers and Mitch Jones of the public interest group Food and Water Watch. Welcome to Whistle Where You Work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Katherine, let's start with you. Just so we know what the baseline is, tell us about water, the water cycle. How does it work?
So the water cycle essentially works with nature. So when we have rainfall in a natural system that would fall to the ground, would filter through the ground and out to the ocean and evaporate back. So under our best circumstances, nature really does a good job of cleaning, filtering, and replenishing our water supply. Over the years, as we've changed our landscape by paving, converting things to farms, cities, and now withdrawing lots of water, our systems really become depleted and more polluted. And so as our water supplies sort of become more fragile, essentially, because we have a static amount of water, we also now have a number of other stresses, urbanization, crumbling infrastructure, and now climate change that are really stressing our water resources.
Okay, so how does climate change affect the water supply?
What we're going to see in climate change is essentially increased frequency of floods, droughts, and also unpredictability of those, so much difficult to plan, so we have to look at uncertainty. And I think...
Do you get the floods in areas that are already rain-rich, water-rich, and the droughts in areas that are already dry, or is it...
It really depends, and so the models are showing different things, leading to some uncertainty, but I think one thing that's important to note is we're already seeing the impacts of climate change, and really that our water resources, our streams and rivers, are going to feel it first and worst. So in the Great Lakes, for example, they're predicting there's going to be more frequent flooding, more intense flooding, and that's going to have an impact on how much sewer overflows reach our waters. And so that's another whole factor people need to start planning for now.
And how are the sewers doing, Mitch?
They're falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
In most of the country, the sewer systems are a minimum 60 years old. They can be older. In some areas in the east, they are over 100 years old. There are still some places which still use old wooden pipe, not even the clay pipe, which is crumbling. In my home city of Baltimore, we have a massive undertaking right now to replace the pipes because they are breaking on a fairly regular basis, almost every day it seems. During wet season, you have water main breaks, you have these overflows that Katherine was talking about, just overtaxing a system which at this point is too old and too fragile to handle it.
And so what do we do about that?
Well, there's a couple of different things we can do, but the most important thing that we need to do is fix the system. And that's going to require a financial commitment to doing it. Unfortunately, in recent years, the federal government has really abdicated its responsibility to fund our sewer and drinking water infrastructure systems.
Is that appropriately a federal function?
I believe that it is. The Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act have made it a federal function primarily because of the environmental impact that these systems have. When the systems overflow, the raw sewage spills into our waterways. Drinking water can leak through these crumbling pipes. We lose 1.7 trillion gallons of water a year in this country just because of leaking infrastructure. So it is a federal role primarily in terms of the environmental impact, but also when you think of the broader scarcity issues that we're dealing with in this country and how are we going to deal with water, I don't know that we can continue to rely on smaller governmental designations to be the primary deposit for our water policy, and that the federal government needs to step in and take control of that more.
And this is really the issue of water and its supply is inextricably tied to energy policy too, isn't it, Katherine?
Yeah.
And sometimes the issue results from trying to fix other problems, like under the Clean Air Act, having coal-fired plants install scrubbers. How's that affecting the water supply?
Yeah, I think it's a great point because there's really an energy-water connection that exists that people really often don't think about. And so as in the rush to sort of look to alternative energy supplies, often we don't take in the big picture of what's the overall impact to our water resources or other environmental resources. And a great example is, the new development of the Marcellus Shale in the sort of the northeastern part of the country, where suddenly they're injecting millions of gallons of water mixed with chemical cocktails down into the ground. It has to be disposed of. It's you use massive water withdrawals, and so really systematically we haven't.
This is in order to extract what?
Natural gas that hasn't really been available or under demanded previously, and now there's demand for it.
So what is the danger here to the water supply? The injection process?
There's a couple points in the process that are potentially dangerous. The chemicals they inject in are confidential. We don't know exactly what's in them.
They're confidential?
Yeah, some of these belong to a company, and so we don't actually know. And out
west, they're proprietary. They're business secrets.
They're business secrets, right? And so that should be known to the public, and of course regulated under our Safe Drinking Water Act. It's exempted right now. And out west, this has caused some real problems with drinking water contamination.
Would these particular chemicals, contaminants, be also exempt under the Clean Air Act if they were placed into the atmosphere?
That's a good question. I don't know any specific chemicals, in part because we don't actually know what's in there. But I think sort of the bigger
But isn't benzene in there?
Yes, that's one of them. Yeah.
And what's benzene like as a chemical? Is it human friendly?
No, you wouldn't want it in your drinking water supply. Definitely not.
And do we know it's there? Do we know it's in the drinking water supply?
In some places. And I think overall, in terms of drinking water safety in the country, overall we're lucky to live in a place that generally has reliable and safe drinking water.
You're talking about in the Washington, D.C. area?
Yeah, across the country, as a matter of fact. Okay. And I think, that's important for people to note because drinking water out of our taps, we should be protecting that instead of moving over to bottled water. So I know at American Rivers, we definitely advocate for trying to think of ways to protect drinking water sources.
Wait, why would the tap water be better than bottled water?
Well, as Mitch can tell you, bottled water often is just coming from the tap, and it's unregulated. We don't know what's in bottled water compared to what's in the tap.
That's right. A large percentage, at least as much as 46% of bottled water is just municipal tap water that has been bottled and is being sold at markups anywhere from 900 to 1900%. And you think about it, what else would you buy if you knew that you were paying a 900% markup for something that you could just go into your house, turn on a tap, and have it come more or less for free for a fair service charge? And in addition, of course, the bottled water provides you with the problem of having all of the excess plastic bottles. About 80% of the plastic bottles don't ever make it into a recycling bin. And so while we're told, these bottles are recyclable, we're reducing the plastic, and therefore we're doing all these great eco-friendly bottles. Well, if only 20% of them are ever getting recycled, the rest of them end up in our waste disposal dumps. They end up on the street. They end up actually in the clean water sewer systems, causing problems for our clean water agencies who are trying to treat the water from our sewer systems.
They also end up in the whirlpool in the Pacific Ocean, which is massive at this point.
They do.
Plastic products.
Yeah, they end up out at the North Pacific Gyre and the plastic whirlpool that is out there, which is roughly the size of Texas.
One way of producing energy is through nuclear power. People say it's safe, it's clean, but it's really a way of boiling water in order to generate energy. And how much water is being used in this process in order to do that? And is this water then safe to drink, to bathe in afterwards?
Well, I was just reading the U.S. Geological Survey says now that 40% of our nation's water withdrawals are associated with energy production, so a huge amount of water going to energy production. So that's just a key factor when we evaluate energy. Nuclear is very water intensive, and certainly in places like in the Southeast several years ago, they were in a severe drought, and the power companies were basically at the point of having to shut down, so they didn't have enough water to run. And so that's another way to think about it. Are these energy sources really stable in terms of their water use into the future? And is there a better way for us to either produce energy and or water? By saving energy, you're saving water, and by saving water, you're saving energy. And so that's a very important connection for people to try to remember and act on.
And how are we in terms of efficiency in using water in agriculture?
We could be better. We're not good. The USGS, the report that Katherine just referred to, indicates that water use for irrigation has gone down slightly in the past 5 years, or between 2000 and 2005 rather. But still, it is the second largest use of water behind thermoelectric water use that we have. And so I think that in terms of agricultural use, we could probably be more efficient than we currently are in our systems of irrigation. I mean, in a lot of places, they still use surface flooding for irrigation. I was reading a report yesterday in which a farmer was asked, well, why do you use this system? And his response was, well, because I can. And this was a farmer in New Mexico. You know, and it's just, he has the water rights. He can do it that way if he wants to, and it has nothing to do with the efficiency of the system itself.
You began, Katherine, by saying that the water supply is static, but the population of the planet is not. The population of the United States has more than doubled since 1950, but the amount of water available has not. It's remained pretty much the same. So in going forward, the United States population growth is at a lower rate than that of the rest of the world. So how are we going to manage going forward?
Well, I mean, water efficiency is the first solution. We should always look at it's the cheapest source of new water supply, and essentially here in the United States we're pretty much water wasters compared to people in the rest of the world. Our average daily consumption is much higher than people in Europe, Australia, who are down to about 40 gallons per capita.
Is that because they're drinking less water?
No, they just have, first of all, efficiency in terms of appliances, what we use in our household. Our appliances are very, wasteful in terms of water. And the other fact is we use water that's treated for drinking water standards. We use that to water our lawns, to flush our toilets, for all uses, when in fact a much better use of, drinking water be for drinking, but to use less highly treated and less energy intensive water for these other uses.
Would that require 2 taps coming into everybody's house so that you have the drinking water supply and then you have a non-drinking water supply, Mitch?
You would have to have a secondary system set up. There would be, a need for some retrofitting to certain areas, but we could begin, of course, right now with setting it up so that new building has the ability to have the internal infrastructure that it needs so that it can have a gray water system if it's a large structure, as to compensate for the clean water aspect of the sewage water and the shower water and the laundry water and all the other things. Of course, not all sewage water, but the ones that qualifies as gray water. So that, we could begin now by, there are subsidy programs and so on and so forth, so that people would want to build buildings that have these green infrastructure components so that we can start this process of becoming more efficient.
Yeah. And I think building on that point, in the issue of infrastructure, it's critical, as Mitch said, to get more funding for our water infrastructure, but also to make sure that it's wisely spent. Yeah. Because, these old systems that are, very fixed and large and energy intensive, we should be looking at more systems that incorporate green infrastructure, water efficiency, water reuse, so they will be resilient into the future as we're looking at, water shortages and climate change.
And we're about out of time, but I wanted to ask real quickly, are there things legislatively that need to happen in the short term to address the water problem?
Yes, I think one of the first things in terms of the infrastructure problem is we need to pass a Clean Water Trust Fund that would set up a dedicated firewalled funding source for our nation's clean water and drinking water infrastructure.
We really need to pass the climate bill, and people need to let the members of Congress know that we need a climate bill that will reduce greenhouse gases, but also provide money for adaptation, so communities can start working now to build in some of these flexible green systems and start getting ready for the changes we're going to see in climate and make sure their communities and rivers can thrive.
Well, many thanks to Mitch Jones of Food and Water Watch and Katherine Baer of American Rivers for helping us better understand the global crisis around water and what we can do about it. When we return, truth-telling about success rates in educating at-risk students. Welcome back to Whistle Where You Work. Universities, like the rest of us, understandably love to tout their success stories. And no story is more properly heartwarming than success in educating at-risk students. But there's a downside to be wary of. Universities have a strong incentive to spin their results and sometimes even commit fraud. That's what Colin Browne, an employee of the University of the District of Columbia, blew the whistle on at his school. He claims he was fired for it, and a jury recently agreed, awarding him $282,000 in damages. Welcome, Mr. Browne, to Whistle Where You Work.
Hi.
Tell me about your educational, occupational background.
Sure. I got my bachelor's degree in psychology from Oakwood College, now Oakwood University, and then I went on to do my master's degree in counseling psychology. So.
And when did you begin working at the University of the District of Columbia?
I began that in the fall of 2006.
And in what capacity?
Program coordinator for what was called a Team 100 program, together to educate, achieve, and matriculate 100 at-risk students.
Okay, and what exactly did you do in that capacity?
My responsibility was to supervise the program, all the day-to-day operations, and basically review the data and report.
And who is Kevin Naker?
Kevin Naker at the time was the director of the counseling center. That was the place where the Team 100 program was housed.
And in the course of your working with him, what did you discover about Mr. Naker?
That he was a very interesting character, to say the least. He presented himself as a doctorate, PhD from Howard University, and did his dissertation on the subject of negrescence, which is black racial identity, and was a licensed professional counselor. What I learned was that he did not have a license, that he did not have a PhD, that he went to Howard University, but he was terminated for incompetence.
And how is it possible that somebody claims to have this pedigree from Howard University, and in the very same city where Howard University is located, the District of Columbia, this person is hired touting this on his resume?
It's amazing. What I've learned is that no one essentially checked into him. He applied for positions and was promoted and worked through his way up in the university for over a course of 8 years.
And there is another thing that bothered you about Mr. Naker, and that is results he was claiming.
Exactly. There was a program, like I said, called Team 100, and essentially the data for that program, when I came aboard, did not exist. The success rate, I was told, was almost 70%, in 69.
What does that mean?
That means that they were able to retain, out of this sample of 100 students, 69 of those students.
For how long?
For over the course of a year. So they came in as freshmen, and they complete the freshman year, and they come back as sophomores. And so at that point, we measure how many of those 100 returned.
And what qualifies one of those people to be at risk and therefore part of this program?
Well, all of these individuals must be randomly selected from the freshman class, incoming freshman class, and they must be first time to college ever, and freshmen.
Okay. And so what did Mr. Naker say about these students?
Well, he said the program was very successful, and that the past year we'd had a 69% success rate.
Is that good?
Oh, that's really good. Excellent.
How does that compare to others?
It was far better than the average. I think that we were about 14 or 15% ahead of the rest of the university, because what we were doing was comparing that sample to the population.
And what were you doing differently than the rest of the population?
Well, I don't know what they were doing to get that 69%. Because, as I indicated, the data just didn't exist.
Was it that it didn't exist, or that the numbers were really less than that?
Well, the numbers were dramatically less than that, and out of the numbers that were presented, it was 42%. Out of those numbers, there was no random selection, and we just really couldn't track down the students. I believe we found maybe 20 or so.
And so what did you do with this information?
I approached the director, Kevin Naker, and I looked at the data.
And he thanked you for telling him that he was misleading everybody. Is that it?
Well, the first time he just ordered me back to my office and just said to cut analyzing the data and move on. And so I was deeply confused at the time.
Was it a hostile encounter?
It was a brief, hostile encounter.
Mm-hmm.
He was doing a number of things and just completely out of hand dismissed the whole thing in its entirety.
Mm-hmm.
Just said remove the analysis
Mm-hmm.
of the data that showed that the students weren't eligible and that the students weren't randomly selected. Of course, I didn't do that.
Mm-hmm. And so what did you then do?
At that time, I began to look more into the matter. And I talked to a number of my coworkers, just asking about the previous year. And I went to a previous colleague that had been transferred to another department within the university, and
Mm-hmm.
requested the data from the previous year. And she handed over the data, and that's how I learned about all of this in more detail. I found out so much more.
Okay, and what is it that you learned?
I learned that the program wasn't functioning, and that there were 3 people in the past year, 12 months, that had my job. And that one of the previous people also tried to say something, but didn't get very far about the program. He expressed some concern. And I found out that there was work done on the program, and that was helpful to me to kind of see what was done, what kind of format was used, these kinds of things.
So what did you do with this new information?
Eventually, it was a couple months of me trying to talk to Kevin Niker. Eventually, I went to his boss and communicated this to his boss.
And who would that be?
His boss was Dr. Belando.
And in what position?
He's the associate vice president.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I spoke with her boss also, who was the vice president of student affairs. I emailed them copies of the data.
Mm-hmm.
I generated a memo
Mm-hmm.
explaining what my findings were. And I talked about all my encounters with Kevin Niker up to that point. With the final one was one where he was smashing his hands against the table, telling me not to go upstairs and not to talk to anybody about this and to go back to my office.
And were the people upstairs responsive to your concerns?
Not at all. In fact, I was unable to find them for several months after I provided this memo, and which was very strange because I met with them on a weekly basis up to that point. So
you have reason to believe that they actually saw the memo?
Oh yes, I actually put a copy in the vice president's hand in addition to the email.
Mm-hmm. And so then what happened to you?
Well, I had a couple meetings with Kevin Niker where he told me to blame all the inconsistencies or irregularities in the data on the admissions office at the University of District of Columbia, which didn't really make sense. And of course, I didn't do that either. Mm-hmm. After that, he told me that he would be auditing my files. And I said, okay, so we're doing a thorough audit of everyone's files? And he said, no, just yours. And the anger in his voice, I knew what that was about. I tried to explain to him that I thought it was best for us to come clean with this information now, that federal dollars and district dollars were involved. Mm-hmm. And I told him that on multiple occasions, kind of almost in a pleading sense, like, this is not personal, this is just wrong.
And your concern, in part, must have been that because there were these public dollars involved, that it could result in defunding of the program.
Yes, that was a major part of it, and also it wasn't. It was just fundamentally wrong. Also,
Sure.
Yeah.
And so, what happened to you then?
Well, at that point, I began to receive a lot of negative feedback, where I'd only been praised up till that point. Not one letter, not one reprimand, not one negative comment.
Yeah.
And so my performance all of a sudden became sorely lacking, and it seemed as though every time I tried to encounter him, he would be very, very tense. And I had meetings with my peers, and he began to berate me before my peers. And I didn't really want to involve anyone else that didn't need to know. But some of my peers told me that they felt that I was trying to get someone in trouble, but they didn't say who.
Right.
And I didn't comment because I felt it was a very, very, very serious matter.
Did you leave UDC voluntarily?
No, I did not. Kevin Niker told me that to go find work, essentially. That was what he told me, and specifically, actually, and then he provided me with a letter of recommendation after I requested it. 2 weeks later, he provided me with that letter.
Okay, so he didn't say you're fired. He said, I'd suggest you find another job.
Yeah.
And I'm going to help you get out of here. And so, appreciative as you were of his offer to help you, you still filed suit against UDC. Tell me about that.
Well, I was there for, I guess, 3 months after he told me to go find work. And I had not found work by that time. And so he removed me, essentially. He told me to get out of the office one day. He just packed up my things, locked my computer, locked my phone, and said leave. And so I packed up my things. However, at the same time, over the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks, I contacted a number of law firms and found that Kevin Necker actually did not have a PhD, that didn't have enough education to qualify to supervise anyone. Unfortunately, I also learned that supervision he was providing me for my license, I was pursuing my license at that time, was invalid, so I couldn't apply for my license.
And what were you asking? This was under the D.C. Whistleblower Act, is that right?
Yes.
And what were you asking for as a remedy to your situation?
I wanted to go back to work and continue providing for my family. That was essentially the major concern I had. I knew we couldn't survive off of just my income, and we were rapidly going under financially. Yeah. That was I would say my second concern. My first concern was that I had several clients who were really, really ill, and when suddenly they came to my office and I wasn't there, the reactions that they had were really painful. They looked me up. They called me on the phone. They were in a lot of emotional pain, and consequently, because I couldn't reach out to them, it was very painful for me also. And so the first step was to go to the university and to tell them, let me see the clients and terminate appropriately with them. And they said, we'll look into it, and I never heard from them again. And so those calls continued for about a month. A lot of, and I tried to follow up, tried to contact psychiatrists for some of the individuals so they can get the medication they needed and so forth. And then, of course, the matters turned to home where the bills were not being paid. And so that became particularly difficult.
And that remedy turned out to be not getting your job back, but significant damage award.
Yes.
And that was a jury trial?
Yes, it was.
And so congratulations to you.
Thank you.
I know you must rest a lot more easily having a little bit of cash buffer as you try to move forward in your life, and we wish you a lot of luck doing that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Many thanks to Colin Browne for his courage in standing up for the truth about retention rates for at-risk students. We need successes and retention rates, but we need real ones. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Whistle Where You Work.